Welcome to the Cafe Culture Podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy, and science.
Welcome to the evening. As Jackie already said, I'm an academic, and as an academic, you give quite a lot of lectures and presentations around the globe, within the UK, but also in Newcastle, in front of students, in front of industry, in front of your peer researchers, but also in front of members from the government. And that's what I do. But so far, I never, talked in front of an audience in a kind of coffee shop environment. And so I'm looking forward. As I'm a researcher, I'm always like to explore new things. So for me, it's new, and I hope we can have a very good discussion. I'm known that I sometimes change a little bit the order. So what I will do is that during my presentation or talk, I will ask you already some kind of questions. So don't worry, you will not be measured like my students, how good you are. But it's just basically to have a good communication and a good discussion, because that is what it's all about. So you hear already the German accent. Sometimes people say I have the Geordie German accent, the double G accent, so I'm not sure if it's true or not. I was born in a town called Wolfsburg. Now, most of you never heard about this town. Wolfsburg is in the north of Germany. It's between Berlin and Hanover. And Wolfsburg is a very unique city, and that is because it has a population of 180,000. No, that is not unique. But 55,000 people of those 180 are going to one factory, and the factory is called Volkswagen. So in Wolfsburg is the headquarter of VW, and you can imagine 55,000 people going in and 55,000 people going out every day. So every second person in Wolfsburg works for Volkswagen, and the other half are working for the automotive supply industry. Which means if you are growing up in this kind of environment, your destiny is already written on your forehead. It has to do something with cars. And that's what I did. So for the last 25 years, I've worked now on electric cars and hybrid electric cars, both in industry and in academia, here now in Newcastle. And I think that was also one of the reasons why I've been asked, to give a presentation on electric cars. Because what are electric cars? We hear quite a lot about them. And I would say, let's have a discussion. Can I ask the audience, how many own actually an electric car? If you raise your hand.
So a pure electric car.
A pure electric car. Nil? Okay, good. How many of those who are sitting here have ever driven an electric car or drove an electric car? There's 1, 2, 3? 3, okay. And can I just ask, what's your experience? And what's your experience in driving an electric car?
It was a little odd to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Odd?
Well, I'm not used to driving automatic.
Right. Okay, good. So it's automatic, yes. Mm-hmm.
And then I didn't know how the car would respond to my hitting the pedals.
Okay, don't know how the car responds.
Slightly anxious about it, but it went fine.
But it worked fine. So you are overall satisfied?
Yes.
Okay, good. And there was another? Yeah. So what is your experience?
I took part in some research which was using an electric vehicle, but it was looking at the driver,
Okay.
driver's reaction and things like that.
Driver's reactions.
Yeah, we just happened to use an electric vehicle.
Okay. And what was your experience? Are you satisfied? Are you happy?
Yeah, I found no problem. I had
No problem.
automatic cars before.
Okay.
It was fine.
Okay, good. So we have 2 satisfied customers. That's very good. Electric cars. What do we know about electric cars? So obviously automatic, so we don't have to shift any gears. What else have we heard about electric cars? We heard about electric cars that they are quiet. Very good. What else?
Short range.
They have a battery, short range.
Range anxiety.
Range anxiety, very good. Pardon? Quiet, yes. And has anybody heard about maybe the green impact, that they are good for the environment? Well,
you can recharge them at home if you have a...
you can recharge them at home, so it's quite convenient. And there was another hand up there. They're powerful, very good. So I think overall, you summarized it in a way. It is right that an electric car is actually more powerful than a combustion engine powered car. And this has something to do with the electric motor. We call it torque, because it produces torque at 0 speed. Then obviously we know that the car needs to be charged. And then yes, there might be the argument that they may be green or good for our environment. And then we heard quite often the word, they are quiet. So the question is quiet good or not?
Not too quiet for pedestrians.
Not good for pedestrians, and that is right. So I guess you may have heard when an electric car reverses, it starts actually to beep. And this beeping can be quite annoying, in particular if you're on a parking system or a park house where you have quite a lot of electric cars, and they all reverse and they all beep. And this beep is actually very high-pitched. And the beep was actually introduced when many years ago in Japan, a guide dog was killed by an electric car. In fact, actually, blind people have difficulties in orienting the electric cars. So quietness is not always good. And myself, I witnessed many years ago when there was a big exhibition in Berlin, and they closed the whole Kurfürstendamm, which is a main street in Berlin, and they had what they called an EV parade. And it was actually very quiet, and everybody was overwhelmed. So the perception in hearing cars will change. But how are we dealing then with those who have difficulties in hearing, and how are we dealing with those who do not respond as fast? And one way is obviously this beeping, but obviously if you think about that all cars starts now to beep, that will be a little bit annoying. So there is the trend that perhaps the electric car of the future will be similar like an ambulance car. As we know, an ambulance car has always a different sound, depending, if it's traveling, if it's approaching a roundabout, or if there's no traffic, they even switch it off. And so one aspect might be that in the future, these electric cars are quiet, but they will detect a scenario where then they will make some kind of noise. And the question is if this type of noise that they will produce will be standardized or not. So something which I want that you take with you about the noise. Good, let's move on. How many cars do we have on Earth? And, well, too many, yeah, but can we quantify this?
Between 1 and 2 billion.
How many?
Between 1 and 2 billion cars.
1 or 2 billion, it's a good, judgment. Anything else? Okay, so it is more than 1 billion. It's not 2 billion yet, but it's also difficult to count, frankly. But let's say we have 1 billion cars. And any idea how many electric cars there are on the road at the moment globally?
Less than 5 million.
Less than 5 million, yeah, that's a good starting point. And we need to lower it a little bit more down, right? So it's in the order of 3 million. Now it depends a little bit if you add an electro-hybrid car or not. But it is roughly, let's say, 3 million. And interestingly, 2017 saw the highest sales on these cars, 1 million, and 50% were sold in China. So in China is a massive boom at the moment on electric cars. So how many cars do we have here in the UK? Electric ones? That's the hardest number to guess. How much? 50,000 is one number.
20
20, yeah. You know, we are quite advanced. We like to buy new technology. So it depends now which literature you read, and again, the way how you count cars. One number is 140,000, which is a quite high number, but anyway, let's keep it. But you can see the difference that overall we have maybe 3 million EVs and 1 billion need to be all electrified. And that is obviously a very big challenge. So I go a little bit about the history about the electric cars because they are not new. It's not quite clear who actually invented it. So there is the Scottish guy, I need to read it always, Robert Anderson, who in 1832 put an electric motor in a carriage because cars, as we know it, didn't exist as such. And there was also no battery in it. And then, over the years, there were individuals who built some electric cars, meaning there was a battery in it. And you found them driving along the roads. And by the beginning of 1900, there were more electric cars in the US than petrol-powered cars. So the electric car, as such, is actually not new. And the electric car was advertised and very popular for women. Why? Well, what they said, this car, it doesn't stink, it doesn't smell, it's easy to drive. But the most important part is because if I have a conventional combustion engine powered car, I need to crank it. As you know from the old films, you need to have a crank and you need to crank the engine. Because the starter at this time was not invented. And for women, apparently, it was difficult to do, so therefore it was a women's car. Now, what happened next was that more and more oil reserves were found, and also more and more streets, and petrol was not sold in pharmacies anymore. It was sold now suddenly at petrol stations. And it means that the electric car died out, and the other reason, and that is really the main reason, is because the starter was invented. So let's say even a woman, if I can say it, was able to start the car, right? So it was at this point also clear that the range of the electric car was very limited, and with a petrol-powered car you could go on and on, well not on and on, but quite well, and that was the end of it. Then in the 60s, 70s, the EV saw another launch, and that was driven by the oil crisis, but it was also driven at the time where most cities, and particularly in the US, had quite a lot of smoke. And we know these pictures from LA, where LA is completely covered, and consequently, then in the US, in particular in California, they set up what is called the Californian Air Resources Board. And they now started to regulate how much fume effectively a car can exhaust. And also their recommendation is that the big car manufacturers must sell electric cars. And they did. They sold them in thousands. So there were a very good number of electric cars in California driving, and one of the most famous one was the General Motors EV1 car. This was actually quite ahead of its time, a very nice designed car. But the bottom line is that the automotive industry didn't like electric cars at all because they cost too much. Too much into research, too much development, production needs to be changed, infrastructure, etc. And the automotive industry lobbied the Californian Air Resources Board so strongly that they effectively collapsed. And so therefore the automotive industry won. And that means even that GM bought back all the cars that they basically gave the EV1 or leased, and they crushed them all. So that shows you that the automotive industry at this time really hated electric cars. All right? Good. And now, where we are now, 1 or 2 million cars globally, much bigger than ever. But why? Why do we have now suddenly so many electric cars? Is it because the automotive industry wants to give themselves a green image so that you buy their petrol cars? Is it because politicians, want to give themselves a green image? Or do actually electric cars really contribute to the environment? And here is a tricky one, because we will discuss later, we need to know where the energy comes from in order to fill up the batteries. But also there's another issue with it, because those who drove electric cars somehow, don't take me now too strong the statement, indirectly contribute maybe to child deaths, to people getting ill, to moving people from homes, and to pollute the environment. But how can this be? That's what we will discuss later. Good, so what is actually an electric car? Now, an electric car is made out of 3 components, which you will not find in an ordinary conventional car. And that is the electric motor, the motor controller, and the battery. So there are the 3 main components. And the battery, as you know, it's DC, so you have plus and minus. And what the motor controller does, it converts the DC voltage into an AC voltage. And we all know AC comes here out of the sockets. And that is because the electric motor requires AC voltage. And the electric motors then can, with the motor controller, determine the speed of the wheels, and consequently you go different speeds. So we heard about already that having an electric car has a range anxiety. So the question is, how far can we actually go with cars today, electric cars? The majority of electric cars, you can go roughly 100 miles. It depends obviously not on the car itself. This is with a battery of an energy level of 24 kilowatt hours. That's how we measure it, the energy. But since then, batteries has actually improved quite a lot. And there's now 40 kilowatts, and in the future, it goes even to 60 kilowatt hours, which means that the range of 300 miles or 350 miles will be reached. And in fact, some of the cars do this. Now, the next argument is, well, hold a minute, if I put obviously more energy in, that means my battery becomes bigger. That is true, but in fairness, technology has moved on. And the size of the battery has not proportionally increased with the size of the energy. So it means that for the same size that we have today, you can basically double the range. And we will see in the future that ranges of 300 miles, 350 miles will be achievable, and some cars have it already. What's with the cost? Well, the battery cost obviously a lot. Going back 5-6 years ago, the cost of the battery was half of the cost of the car, and so therefore unacceptable. And today, this has dropped. And the future again is that within the next 10 years, and you can read different studies on this one, that the cost of the electric car will be nearly equal to the cost of a conventional car. So range and cost, effectively, do not matter too much. But what is it then? Now, the tricky part is you need to charge the car. And we heard earlier, well, a home charger. So going back to our batteries that the old cars have, let's say the old Nissan Leaf, with 24 kilowatt hours, then at home you have a charger of 3 kilowatts. And mostly you can charge then the battery overnight, fully, so in 8 hours. So that means our behavior in terms of charging, in terms of refilling a car, is you just go home, plug it in, and then the next morning when you go to work, you drive with it and it is fully charged. Well, that is true so long you have a car which goes for 100 miles. But if you now have the car which goes for 350 miles, you have much more energy density, And so consequently, if you want to charge the battery fully, it takes you a whole day at home. And this is obviously something which is not acceptable. So the only way forward is you need to increase the charging power. And we see it here in Newcastle, and we are blessed here in Newcastle, the highest charging density in the UK. There are more charging points in London, but obviously London has more people. So in the area of Newcastle and around, there are roughly 1,200 charging points. So we are blessed, you can say. And these power, or the charging power, varies, and the biggest one which we can find is 50 kilowatt. There are a few bigger ones, but let's say 50 kilowatts. We call them fast charger. However, even if you go with 50 kilowatt, you will not be able to charge the car in a good time that is acceptable. And so therefore, in Europe, they are building now power stations, or not power stations, but charging stations in the order of 350 kilowatt. And that is a lot of power. In fact, the car manufacturer Porsche wants to see 500 kilowatt, a half a megawatt on power, just charging one car. So now you all know the situation. You drive on the highway, you go to the next highway petrol station, and there are at least 20 different points where you can tap the car. So they would need to be all replaced with 20 of these fast charger. So 20 times a half megawatt. And this power needs to be delivered at that point. And what's even worse, if all the cars, if all are occupied, you need to have the power available. Now, here you can see already in which direction I'm going. It is effectively the infrastructure. And last year, when there was an announcement by the BBC, not by the BBC, by the government, where they would like to forward the cars, the legislation, from 2040 to 2032. So by 2040, the UK government said that all new sold cars must be electric. This is not quite in line with Europe. Some European countries move forward, and so therefore the UK said they would like to move forward as well to 2032. But the question is now, by 2032, do we have actually enough charging points? And this will be very challenging, if not even impossible. So the question here now is, what can we do? Now, one challenge is also that we need to ask ourselves, where does actually the energy come from? So we all know if the energy is produced by wind power or solar power, then we can argue it's green. Now comes the next category where people say, well, if it's basically powered by nuclear, you can also argue it is green. Well, yeah, it is green, but then the debate starts, what is with the nuclear waste? Are you including this or are you excluding it? Yeah. And then obviously the rest is from gas and coal, and Britain still uses more than 30% of the gas to make electricity. So the problem is, therefore, if we exclude nuclear and gas and only rely on renewables, and that is obviously a good source, then we have the problem of what we call intermittency. As we all know, the sun is not always shining and the wind is not always blowing. And sometimes it's actually even producing too much power. So that means we need to store the excess power. And you do this by using batteries. But where do you put the batteries? Well, you need to put the mega batteries along the power line. And these can look quite big, and they may sometimes not very attractive, and not everybody wants them along the power line. So, therefore, what the automotive industry and also the supply industry thinks of, well, hold a minute, in every car we have a battery anyway, so why do we not use the battery in the car to stabilize the grid, right? And we call this vehicle to grid. So what does it actually mean? It means that you use the batteries of these electric cars on one hand so that they actually be charged, but on the other hand also to balance the power flow. And in principle, it works. But what does it mean for us? Because suddenly, you are not only charging energy and paying for the energy, suddenly we all become business people because we are now starting to sell energy into the grid. Those of you, I don't know if there's anybody who has solar panels on the roof. Right, so 1, 2, 3. So you pay a tariff, correct? And therefore you also earn money, correct? Okay, so that's what we perhaps do in the future too. And that means everybody of us, car owner with an electric car, with vehicle to grid, you set your own price. And when the price is right, you're basically putting power into the grid. And you can see already that some clever people say, well, okay, I go with my car at one time to a special spot where now it's cheap, charge the car, and then I drive a couple of hours later somewhere else and sell it, the energy. Think about it. But the bottom line is, it will certainly change our behavior. And it is not quite clear in which direction we are going. What is clear is that if vehicle to grid comes, it means consequently you will always plug in your car. At the moment when we drive our car, we just go to the petrol station. But if you drive an electric car, wherever you are, even if it's at home, where you may not be even able to charge the car fully, we will, in the future, plug in, plug in, plug in. It will become a habit. And therefore, there's some work going on where you don't do charging via cable, but you do charging via, we call it like a coil, like inductive charging, which is some research at the moment. Okay, good. Now, I need to just flip over here. So, yeah, we talked about the renewable energy, and we talked about the intermittency. And just to complete on these inductive charging, there are some kind of concepts, in particular in South Korea, where effectively the inductive charging, so you have a coil in the road and a coil in the car, and the energy goes wireless, right? But you put the coil along the road, so that the car is basically charged all the times. So you can see this in South Korea. On the road, buses will be charged like this. There are some issues with it, which I don't want to go into detail, but having this one obviously has the advantage that on one hand you don't need to plug in and plug out, but also it has the advantage that you reduce the size of the battery because the power is there all the time. So we may not need a battery in the future. Okay. So now I need to go back to the critical remark that I made earlier. So if we obviously drive an electric car, then we may contribute that people are getting harmed. Now the question is, how is that? If we assume that the electric car is charged by solar power or wind power, where will be the harm? If we know that there is some kind of noise device which will basically protect people around the car, so that should be all right. But, you know, why? So we need to think about what are actually the materials we need to build a motor and to build a battery. And perhaps the most common material that you heard about it is lithium-ion batteries. So all car manufacturers, as far as I'm aware of, are using now lithium-ion battery. And it is a very powerful battery. It's a lovely battery, right? And this is a battery which will give you the range of 300 miles or 350 miles. But then the question is, you know, where do you get the lithium, right? And interestingly, first of all, the biggest mines are all in South America. And also to extract it, there are two ways. Either it is basically in water. So in Chile, for instance, they capture the water which has the lithium contents, and then, like salt, they dry it out, and then you have it. And others is in rocks, so you need to use some kind of solvent mechanism to extract it. The other question or point that you hear quite often is there enough lithium actually available in the world to power our 1 billion cars? The answer is nobody knows. At the moment, some of the statistics argue there is. One aspect is that to some degree you can actually recycle the material. And in fact, there's quite a lot of work going on in how to recycle the battery material effectively. So the argument that you sometimes hear with lithium, it's not enough there and it might be dangerous, is actually not quite true. It is feasible. There's one other point which nobody knows except the car manufacturer, and that is lithium batteries. When people talk about lithium batteries, it's not one type of battery. There are quite a lot of subchemicals included, and these subchemicals stay as a secret with the car manufacturer. But I'm pretty sure they are fully aware of whatever they put in, that they should not use obviously material which is rare or which is toxic. Although saying this, we need to remind them all the time, because obviously we just had the diesel scandal, and this is obviously something where we need to remind the automotive industry, to mix a good cocktail. So if it's not the battery, what is it then? Is it the copper? Because we need copper to wind the motor and for all the wires. And here again, copper is a fantastic material in terms of recycling. And copper has been mined quite, how can I say, not quite unfair, in particular in Africa. But standards has been now raised so that the mining of copper is relatively controlled, or good controlled, so that people are not having any harm, or that people don't get to any harm. So copper, it's not either copper. So what is it then? Now we need to look a little bit deeper into the electric motor, and most electric motors using magnets. And the reason why they put magnets in is to build the motor as small as possible, but also to make it as powerful as possible. So the most common material that they use is NeoDo. And now the problem starts. China holds 97% of the NeoDo material. And that means they dictate the price. But also, basically, to get NeoDo, it's not like lying on the ground. You need to go through etching and solving, and a process which is quite toxic. And there are stories, and you can see them also on the internet sometimes in pictures, where you see these kind of mines in China, where effectively people are exposed to all of these fumes which come with this process. And it has been reported basically that people have died because of it. But also because of the mining, it's a relatively large area, so people have to move. And so it makes an impact to people. And there's something obviously what we need to do. And one aspect is to try to regulate it within China, so you can talk to China. But it's a little bit more complicated to regulate it because NeoDo can be also found in other processes and in other materials. And quite often, some companies which manufacture a material will use NeoDo as a byproduct to sell it off. So it's very difficult. The only way forward is to build motors without magnets, but then they become quite big. But I think that is the only technical way forward, right, to do more research and to do more work in this area. But this, I think, is the most, let's say, dangerous, if I can use the word dangerous material that we have in the electric car. You need to remind me on the time, by the way. Right, 5 minutes, all right, okay. Good, so I mentioned already that the UK by 2040 officially wants to sell, or wants that if you buy a car, that it will be an electric car only. And they may forward this to 2032. And the UK is actually quite keen to become the front runner in electric cars. So just recently, last year, they announced what they call the Faraday Institution. And the Faraday Institution is set up by the government and by industry to allow the UK industry to become the lead in battery manufacturing research development. So everything which has to do with batteries, and they are pumping quite a lot of money at the moment into the system. Again, here in Newcastle, or in the region, northeast region, we are quite blessed because we have obviously Nissan just around the corner. Unfortunately, Nissan was slightly under the bad news, which we heard, that Nissan decided not to build the conventional X-Trail. But nevertheless, they still manufacture the Nissan Leaf, and they have the only battery plant, large battery plant in Europe. We shall not forget about this. So the whole region here, the Northeast, is actually an electric vehicle community, a hotspot, if you like. Yeah. And quite often people are not aware of it. You only see some of these black pillars and wonder yourself, why are they there? And sometimes they are not even used. Finally, what we should also discuss are jobs. It is clear that you need more jobs to manufacture an engine or a conventional car. There are more jobs depending than if you build an electric car, because the electric motor is relatively easy to make. But on the other hand, you need obviously experts in battery, so chemists, for instance. So I think in the future, there will be also a shift from those who have a good understanding on engines, so mechanical engineers mostly, into the electrical side and into the science side, because that is basically what electric cars need. And also we shall not forget about the topic autonomous cars. Now, autonomous cars, we shall not mix them up. They are not only applicable to electric cars, they're also applicable to conventional cars, because autonomy doesn't matter what power drivetrain you are using. And the autonomy as a whole, as a new business, will, which is predicted, pick up the jobs that you may lose if you move the power drivetrain from a combustion engine car into an electric one. And so therefore, overall, there shouldn't be any job losses. In fact, there should be actually more job creation. Good, so this brought you a little bit to, or this hopefully gives you a little bit an idea where we are with the electric cars, how they may or will change our lives in the future. It will not be radical, but we will see changes. But the bottom line is, is it again just a glimpse like we have it in the past, that they may die out again for whatever reason? Or will it now become an electric EV revolution and we say goodbye to the petrol and diesel powered cars? And that is what we can discuss. So thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to receive your questions. Thank you.